It was supposed to be a dream vacation, a perfect getaway for Lisa, her husband Mark, and their 6-year-old daughter, Sophie. The cruise ship was alive with music, laughter, and the endless stretch of the ocean shimmering under the moonlight. Everything felt like a scene from a beautiful postcard. But that night, something happened that would change their lives forever. Mark and Sophie went for a late-night stroll on the deck, enjoying the cool ocean breeze. Sophie giggled as she pointed at the waves, her small hands gripping the railing. Mark walked beside her, lost in thought. It was a quiet moment between a father and his daughter until it wasn't. They never came back. Lisa waited in their cabin, expecting them to return any minute. Minutes turned to hours, and worry clawed at her chest. She searched the ship frantically, asking passengers and crew members if they had seen her husband and daughter. But no one had. It was as if they had vanished into thin air. Security was called. The ship was searched. Yet, there was no trace of them. No signs of a struggle, no cries for help, nothing. The official report suggested that they might have fallen overboard, but there was no proof. No one saw them go over. They were just gone. 7 years passed. Lisa had tried to move on, but a part of her was frozen in time, stuck in that endless night when her family disappeared. Life went on around her, but inside, she was trapped in a never-ending storm of grief and unanswered questions. Then, one evening, as she walked past a dimly lit alley, something made her stop. Her breath caught in her throat. A figure stood there, half hidden in the shadows. For a moment, she thought her mind was playing tricks on her. But then the figure turned, and Lisa's heart nearly stopped. It was a face she never thought she'd see again. Her world spun. Her knees nearly gave out. 7 years of pain, confusion, and loss came crashing down in one overwhelming wave. Could it really be? This moment was about to change everything. But the story doesn't end here, it's only just beginning. Lisa couldn't move. Her feet felt cemented to the ground as she stared at the figure standing in the alleyway. The dim streetlight barely illuminated the person's face, but she didn't need more light to know what her heart was screaming. It was Sophie. It had to be. Her mind raced, struggling to make sense of what she was seeing. 7 years. 7 long years of believing her daughter was gone forever, lost to the ocean, swallowed by the darkness. And yet, here she was standing just a few feet away, looking older, different, but still her little girl. Lisa's breath hitched. Her instincts screamed at her to run to Sophie, to pull her into her arms and never let go. But something stopped her. Sophie wasn't alone. A man stood beside her. He was tall, broad-shouldered, his face partially hidden under the hood of his jacket. His body language was tense, protective, as if shielding Sophie from whatever was out there, including Lisa. Lisa's heart pounded. She wanted to call out, but her voice caught in her throat. What if she was wrong? What if this was all some horrible trick her mind was playing on her? Or worse, what if she was right? The figure, her daughter, shifted slightly, her face coming into better view. Lisa's stomach turned. The eyes were the same deep hazel that had once looked up at her with pure love and trust. But there was something different now. A guardedness. A hesitation. Lisa took a shaky step forward. Sophie. Her voice was barely more than a whisper, but the moment the name left her lips, the man beside Sophie stiffened. The girl's eyes widened slightly, a flicker of recognition flashing across her face. But then, just as quickly, she looked away, as if forcing herself not to react. The man grabbed her wrist, and Lisa saw the subtle but urgent way his fingers tightened around it. No, Lisa gasped, panic gripping her. Wait. But the man didn't wait. He turned, pulling Sophie with him, disappearing deeper into the alley. Lisa's body finally reacted. She lunged forward, her heart slamming against her ribs. Sophie. Her voice echoed down the alley, but by the time she reached the corner, they were gone. Lisa stood there, gasping for breath, her hands shaking violently. She had seen her. She knew it was her. But why? Why had Sophie acted like she didn't know her? And who was that man? Tears blurred Lisa's vision, but she forced herself to focus. She couldn't lose her daughter again. Not this time. She looked around wildly, searching for any clue, any sign of where they had gone. The alley was narrow, lined with old brick buildings, a few rusted dumpsters, and scattered trash. There was no clear exit, but there were plenty of places to hide. Lisa took another step forward, her ears straining for any sound, any movement. But all she could hear was the distant hum of the city, the muffled chatter of people in the distance. It was as if the night had swallowed them whole. A cold shiver ran down her spine. What was happening? How had Sophie ended up here after all these years? And why had she run? Lisa felt a rush of memories flooding back, the cruise, the laughter, the warmth of the sun on their faces. Then the panic, the endless searching, the helplessness. The way the authorities had looked at her with pity when they told her there was no hope. But there had been hope. Because Sophie was alive. Lisa pressed a hand to her mouth, trying to steady her breathing. She needed to think. If Sophie was here, it meant someone had taken her. Someone had kept her hidden for all these years. And now, they were trying to keep her hidden again. Lisa clenched her fists. No. She wasn't going to let that happen. She turned, hurrying back toward the main street. She needed help. But from who? The police. They hadn't been able to find Sophie before. Would they even believe her now? Her thoughts were racing as she reached the street, her eyes scanning the sidewalk, searching for anyone who might have seen something. But the city moved on as if nothing had happened. Lisa swallowed hard. She needed a plan. She needed to find them before they disappeared for good. Then, something caught her eye, a small figure sitting on a bench just down the block. A teenage boy, maybe 16 or 17, wearing a worn-out hoodie and sneakers that looked too big for his feet. Lisa wouldn't have thought twice about him, except for one thing. He was staring at her. The moment their eyes met, the boy looked away, shoving his hands into his pockets. But Lisa saw it, the flicker of recognition, the nervous tension in his posture. He had seen something. Lisa didn't hesitate. She hurried toward him, her heart hammering. "Hey," she said, her voice urgent but not aggressive. "Did you see them?" The boy hesitated, his eyes darting left and right, as if checking if someone was watching. Lisa leaned in. "Please. The girl, she's my daughter. I just need to know where they went." The boy bit his lip, then finally muttered under his breath, "They go down that way sometimes." He jerked his head toward the end of the block. "But you didn't hear it from me." Lisa followed his gaze. The street curved into another alley, darker than the last. Her pulse quickened. She turned back to thank him, but the boy was already walking away, disappearing into the night. Lisa took a deep breath and faced the alley. She had a choice. She could wait. Go to the police. Try to explain the impossible. Or she could go after them herself. The decision was already made. With one last deep breath, Lisa stepped forward, vanishing into the darkness. Lisa moved cautiously through the dark alley, her heart pounding so loudly she could hear it in her ears. The boy's words replayed in her mind, "They go down that way sometimes." That meant they had been here before. It wasn't random. Whoever had taken Sophie had a reason for being in this part of the city. The further she went, the quieter it became. The noise of the city faded, leaving only the sound of her own footsteps. Old brick buildings loomed on either side, their windows dark, some broken. There were no streetlights here, just the occasional flicker of a neon sign far in the distance. Lisa's mind raced. If Sophie was here, if she was alive all this time, who had been keeping her? And why? She reached the end of the alley, where it split into two paths. Her breath caught. No sign of Sophie or the man who had taken her. Which way? Then she heard it. A soft shuffling sound. She pressed herself against the wall, peering carefully around the corner. A metal door creaked open just a few feet away, and the hooded man stepped out, alone this time. He looked around cautiously before shutting the door behind him and locking it with a key. Lisa's stomach twisted. Sophie was inside. She was sure of it. The man hesitated for a second, then started walking in the opposite direction. Lisa held her breath, waiting until he disappeared around the next corner before she moved. Her fingers trembled as she reached for the handle. Locked. She needed a way in. Her eyes darted around, searching. There was a rusted fire escape a few feet above her, its ladder just out of reach. She grabbed a nearby crate, pulling it beneath the ladder, then climbed up, her muscles burning with tension. When she reached the window, she hesitated. If she was caught? No. She couldn't think like that. She had already lost Sophie once. She wasn't going to lose her again. She pressed her hands against the glass, peering inside. The room was dimly lit, barely furnished, just a cot, a chair, and an old dresser. Then she saw her. Sophie sat on the edge of the cot, her hands folded in her lap. She looked older, taller, but her face, it was still her. Lisa felt tears burn her eyes. She reached out, tapping the glass softly. Sophie's head snapped up, her eyes wide. For a second, they just stared at each other. Then, Sophie shook her head. Lisa frowned. What? Sophie looked toward the door, fear flashing across her face. Lisa understood immediately. Someone else was here. She scanned the room again, and that's when she noticed the shadow moving in the far corner. Lisa's heart stopped. There was another person in the room. A woman, standing near the dresser, her back turned. Lisa had no time to think. If she didn't act now, she might lose this chance. She reached for the window latch, but before she could move, Sophie did something that made her freeze. Sophie lifted her hands slowly and formed the words with her lips. Run. Now. Lisa's entire body went cold. Then the door burst open. The hooded man from before stormed in, his voice sharp. What are you doing? Lisa couldn't hear Sophie's response, but she saw the way the girl flinched, how she shrank back. The man stepped closer. His face was still hidden under the hood, but his stance, his posture, it sent a chill through Lisa. He wasn't just anyone. He was someone to Sophie. Someone she feared. Lisa's hands curled into fists. She needed to do something. But before she could act, she heard footsteps in the alley below. More people. Lisa backed away from the window. She couldn't go through the door. She couldn't go through the window without being seen. She had to get out. She climbed back down the fire escape as fast as she could, her heart hammering. Just as her feet hit the ground, she saw two figures enter the alley. They weren't the police. They weren't random strangers. They were looking for her. Lisa turned and ran. She didn't stop, didn't look back until she was far from the alley, blending into the crowd of the city streets. Her hands shook as she pulled out her phone. She had no proof. No idea where to go next. But she knew one thing. Sophie was alive. And she was in danger. Lisa wasn't going to stop until she got her back. Lisa's breath came in quick, shallow gasps as she wove through the crowded streets, her mind racing. Her legs ached, but she didn't slow down. She had no idea who those men in the alley were or how they had known she was there, but one thing was clear, this was bigger than she had ever imagined. Someone had taken Sophie, someone had kept her for 7 years, and now they would do anything to keep her hidden. She needed a plan. She needed help. Her first instinct was to go to the police, but doubt crept in. What would she even tell them? That she had seen her daughter, who was supposed to be dead, through a window? That a stranger had warned her to run? Without proof, would they even believe her? Lisa ducked into a dimly lit cafe, her hands shaking as she pulled out her phone. She scrolled through her contacts, hesitating before landing on one name, Detective Harris. He had been the lead investigator when Mark and Sophie disappeared. He had tried to help her back then, even when the case went cold. If anyone would listen, maybe it was him. Her fingers hovered over the call button when she felt it eyes on her. Lisa's spine stiffened. Slowly, she turned her head, scanning the cafe. It was late, the place nearly empty, but near the entrance, a man sat alone, a cup of untouched coffee in front of him. He wasn't looking directly at her, but something about the way he held himself, the way his eyes flickered toward her every few seconds, sent a warning through her veins. She stood abruptly, shoving her phone into her pocket. She needed to get out. As she stepped toward the exit, so did the man. Lisa's pulse spiked. She pushed through the door, forcing herself to stay calm. Act normal. She blended into the crowd, walking briskly but not running. If she ran, he would know she had seen him. She glanced at a storefront window, using the reflection to check behind her. The man was following. Panic threatened to take over, but she forced herself to think. She needed to lose him. A train station was up ahead. If she could get inside, she might be able to disappear. Lisa pushed through the turnstiles, moving toward the nearest platform. The sound of an approaching train rumbled through the station, and she risked another glance back. The man had picked up his pace. The train doors slid open. Lisa darted inside just as the warning chime rang. The doors began to close. A hand shot out, stopping them. Lisa's stomach dropped as the man stepped into the train, just a few feet away. She forced herself to breathe. She was in a public place. He wouldn't try anything here. Would he? The train lurched forward. Lisa gripped the metal pole, her knuckles white. She could feel his presence behind her, the weight of his stare pressing against her back. Then, he moved closer. Stop looking for her. Lisa's blood ran cold. His voice was low, almost calm, but the threat in it was unmistakable. She turned her head slightly, just enough to see his face in her peripheral vision. He was older than she expected, maybe in his 50s, with sharp features and eyes that held no warmth. Lisa swallowed hard. Who are you? His expression didn't change. Walk away now, and you might stay safe. Lisa's hands clenched into fists. She's my daughter. He tilted his head slightly, as if considering her words. Then, he stepped back, blending into the crowd as the train slowed for the next stop. As soon as the doors opened, he was gone. Lisa stood frozen, her heart racing. Whoever he was, he had known exactly who she was. And he had just given her a warning. But Lisa wasn't going to stop. If anything, she was more determined than ever. She had to find Sophie before it was too late. Lisa stepped off the train, her knees slightly weak, her mind buzzing with 1,000 thoughts. The man was gone, but his warning still echoed in her head. Walk away now, and you might stay safe. He wasn't bluffing. Whoever had taken Sophie had people watching, people willing to threaten her just to keep their secrets buried. But why? What were they hiding? And how far would they go to silence her? She had no answers, but she knew one thing: she wasn't backing down. Lisa hurried through the station, pulling out her phone. This time, she didn't hesitate. She dialed Detective Harris's number, pressing the phone to her ear as she pushed through the exit doors. It rang once, twice. Then, Harris. His voice was gruff, the same as she remembered. Lisa exhaled shakily. It's me. Lisa Carter. There was a beat of silence. Then, his voice softened just a fraction. Lisa, it's been a long time. I found her, she blurted. I found Sophie. Another pause. Lisa. I know how it sounds, she cut in. But I saw her. She's alive. Harris sighed. Lisa, They're watching me, she whispered, stepping into the shadows of a nearby alley to keep out of sight. A man followed me. He told me to stop looking. Harris didn't speak for a long moment. Then, finally, where are you? Lisa gave him the location, and he agreed to meet her at a diner a few blocks away. She hung up, her hands still trembling. 15 minutes later, she slid into a booth near the back of the small, dimly lit diner. Harris arrived soon after, looking older, more tired than she remembered. His sharp eyes studied her as he sat down across from her. All right, he said, folding his hands on the table. Tell me everything. Lisa did. She told him about the alley, the hooded man, Sophie's silent warning at the window, and the stranger on the train who had threatened her. Harris listened without interrupting, his face unreadable. When she finished, he exhaled and rubbed his jaw. This isn't the first time I've heard something like this. Lisa's breath caught. What do you mean? There have been rumors, he admitted. For years, I've come across cases where people vanish: adults, kids, families. And sometimes, years later, someone claims to have seen them. Alive. But when we dig, the trail always goes cold. Lisa swallowed. Do you think she was taken as part of something bigger? Harris hesitated, then nodded. Maybe. But if that's true, it means whoever's behind it is powerful enough to keep it buried. He leaned in, lowering his voice. And if they know you're looking, Lisa, you're in serious danger. Lisa's fingers curled around the edge of the table. I don't care. Her voice was steady, despite the fear clawing at her. I need to get her back. Harris studied her, then sighed. All right. But if we do this, we do it carefully. He pulled out a notepad. Tell me everything about the building where you saw her. Lisa described the alley, the fire escape, the locked door, and the mysterious woman inside the room with Sophie. Harris frowned. The woman, you said she had her back turned? Lisa nodded. What did she look like? I didn't get a good look, Lisa admitted. But she wasn't young. Older, maybe in her 50s or 60s. Harris's frown deepened. He pulled out his phone and started scrolling. A few years ago, we were investigating a human trafficking ring. We couldn't prove anything, but there were whispers about a woman involved, someone who helped raise the children who were taken. He turned the phone screen toward Lisa. Does this look like her? Lisa's stomach twisted as she stared at the grainy surveillance photo. The image was old, but something about the posture, the build, it felt familiar. I think so. Harris nodded grimly. Her name is Margaret Kane. She used to work in child services, but she disappeared after an internal investigation. No one knows where she is now. Lisa's pulse pounded. You think she's the one who has Sophie? If she is, we need to move fast. Harris stood, slipping his phone back into his pocket. Stay somewhere safe tonight. I'll see what I can dig up. Lisa hesitated. Harris, what if it's bigger than we think? His jaw tightened. Then we find out exactly who we're up against. Lisa nodded, but deep down, she knew this wasn't just about Sophie anymore. Whatever she had stumbled into, it was dangerous. And she had just become a target. Lisa barely slept that night. Every sound outside her window made her jump, every shadow seemed like a threat. She knew she was being watched, but she also knew she was closer than she had ever been in 7 years. Somewhere in that dark, hidden world, Sophie was waiting. Waiting for her mother to find her. By morning, Harris had news. He had traced Margaret Kane's last known address to an abandoned building just outside the city. It was risky, but they didn't have time to wait. Every second Sophie remained in that place, she was in danger. Lisa and Harris drove in silence, tension thick in the air. The building loomed ahead, its windows shattered, walls covered in faded graffiti. It looked lifeless, forgotten. But Lisa knew better. Someone had been inside, someone had been keeping Sophie here. Harris pulled the car into a side alley, out of sight. We go in quiet, he warned. No sudden moves. If we see her, we get her out fast. Lisa nodded, her heart racing. They crept toward the entrance, Harris leading the way. The door was locked, but a broken window provided just enough space to slip inside. Dust filled Lisa's lungs as she stepped into the darkness. The air was thick with the scent of damp wood and something else, something stale, like time had stood still inside these walls. A noise. A soft shuffle from above. Lisa's pulse jumped. She glanced at Harris, who nodded. Slowly, they moved toward the staircase, each step creaking under their weight. Then, voices. Lisa froze. One was a woman's. Low, commanding. The other. A child's. Lisa's breath caught. Sophie. She wanted to run, to call out, but Harris held up a hand. Not yet. They needed to be careful. They reached the top of the stairs, pressing against the wall. The door ahead was slightly open, revealing a dimly lit room. Lisa peeked through the gap, her chest tightening at what she saw. Sophie sat on a tattered chair, hands folded in her lap. Her hair was longer now, her face older, but it was her. It was really her. And standing beside her, speaking in a calm, almost motherly voice, was Margaret Kane. Lisa's hands curled into fists. You've done so well, sweetheart, Margaret was saying. You know the rules. We stay together. We stay safe. Sophie didn't respond. She just stared at the floor, her expression blank. Lisa couldn't wait any longer. She shoved the door open, her voice breaking. Sophie. Margaret spun, shock flashing in her eyes. For a split second, No one moved. Then, chaos erupted. Margaret reached for something, Lisa didn't know what, and she didn't care. She rushed forward, grabbing Sophie's hand. "It's me, baby. It's Mom. I'm here." Sophie stiffened, her eyes widening. Lisa felt a surge of panic. Would she remember her? Would she even believe this was real? Then, Mom." Sophie's voice was barely a whisper, but it shattered everything inside Lisa. Tears blurred her vision. "Yes, sweetheart. It's me." Margaret moved suddenly, reaching for Sophie, but Harris was faster. He pulled his weapon, his voice sharp. "Don't." Margaret froze, her expression unreadable. Then, slowly, she smiled. "You think you've won," she said softly. "But you have no idea what you've stepped into." Lisa didn't care. She had Sophie, and that was all that mattered. They moved quickly, Harris keeping his gun trained on Margaret as they backed toward the door. But just as they reached the stairs, Sophie tugged on Lisa's arm. "Mom," she whispered, eyes wide with fear. "There's more. There are others." Lisa's heart stopped. Harris's expression darkened. "How many?" Sophie swallowed hard. "A lot." A sound echoed from below, footsteps. Lisa's breath caught. They weren't alone. And this wasn't over. Lisa's grip on Sophie tightened as the heavy footsteps echoed from the stairwell below. Her heartbeat pounded in her ears, drowning out all other sounds. Harris took a step back, his gun still aimed at Margaret, but his eyes flickered toward the stairs. He was calculating, preparing. They had to move now. Margaret remained standing in the doorway, a knowing smile creeping onto her lips. "You think you can just walk out of here?" Her voice was calm, unsettling. "You don't understand, Lisa. You've stepped into something much bigger than you realize." Lisa wasn't listening. She was already backing toward the window, scanning for a way out. The footsteps grew louder, whoever was coming wasn't in a hurry, but they weren't far. Harris took control. "We're leaving," he said firmly. "If you try to stop us, I won't hesitate." Margaret let out a soft chuckle, as if amused by the idea. "Oh, detective," she said, tilting her head. "You've been chasing shadows for years, haven't you? And yet, here we are again." Lisa didn't care about the games. She turned to Sophie, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "Baby, I need you to be strong, okay? We're going to get out of here. Stay close to me." Sophie nodded, but her small hand trembled in Lisa's grip. The first figure appeared in the stairwell, a tall man in dark clothing, his face partially hidden in the shadows. He didn't speak, just stood there, watching. Another figure joined him. Then another. Lisa's stomach twisted. There were more. Harris didn't hesitate. He grabbed Lisa's arm, urging her toward the window. "We're jumping," he said under his breath. Lisa's eyes widened. They were on the second floor. But there was no other choice. Harris kicked the window out, glass shattering as the cool night air rushed in. Below, the alley stretched into darkness, but the ground wasn't too far. Margaret sighed. "You're making a mistake." Lisa didn't wait. She lifted Sophie first, lowering her as far as she could before letting her drop into the waiting arms of Harris, who had already jumped. Sophie stumbled but was caught safely. Lisa turned back. The men in the stairwell started moving toward them. She jumped. The impact sent a jolt through her legs, but she ignored the pain. Harris was already pulling Sophie toward the car. Lisa grabbed her daughter's hand, running faster than she ever had before. Shouts erupted behind them. Lisa didn't look back. They reached the car, Harris yanking the door open as Lisa and Sophie scrambled inside. The engine roared to life, tires screeching as they sped away into the night. For a long moment, no one spoke. Lisa held Sophie close, her heart racing. Harris kept his eyes on the road, his grip tight on the wheel. The city lights blurred past them. Then, finally, Sophie whispered, "Mom, they took other kids, too." Lisa's breath caught. She pulled back, searching Sophie's face. "How many?" Harris asked quietly. Sophie hesitated. "A lot. Some were younger than me." Lisa's stomach twisted. She had Sophie back, but what about the others? What about the children still trapped in that nightmare? Harris's jaw tightened. We'll find them, he said. I swear it. Lisa held Sophie tighter. She had her daughter back, that was all she had wanted for 7 years. But she knew this wasn't the end. This was just the beginning of something much bigger. Days passed in a blur. Sophie was safe, but she was different. Quiet. Guarded. Lisa didn't push her to talk, but she stayed by her side every moment. Harris dug deeper. With the little information Sophie had given, he started uncovering more missing children reports, abandoned buildings, whispers of a network too deep to be coincidence. The authorities moved in, but Margaret Kane was gone. Disappeared like a ghost. Lisa knew they would never find her. But she also knew this: Margaret had made one mistake. She had underestimated a mother's love. Sophie was home. She was safe. And Lisa would never stop fighting for the ones still lost in the dark. One evening, as Lisa sat beside Sophie on the couch, brushing through her hair, her daughter looked up at her. I knew you'd come, Sophie whispered. Tears welled in Lisa's eyes. I would have searched forever. Sophie smiled, just a little, and for the first time in 7 years, Lisa felt whole again.